So you should all be co-hosts now. Fantastic. Okay, wonderful. Well, it's nice to see so many familiar faces. This makes me very happy. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us today. Hello and welcome. This is the first clinical neuroanatomy seminar debate today with Olga Dragoy and Bonilha as our speakers and the entire CNS team in the background, which I'm going to introduce in a minute. So I said this is the first seminar because we took a creative break for 2 years. We took our free time to come up with a new format and a new way of hosting those sessions. And rather than just doing talks as we know it, where one person presents on one topic, we thought we'd mix it up a little bit. So what we do now is different formats. We have the debates, such as the one today, where two distinct figures in the field are debating a topic that is still up for discussion in the literature and try to elucidate both sides of an argument with the aim to come up with a comprehensive understanding of where our current ideas in the literature are coming from and where we can go to in the future. The other format that we have are the CNS movies. So this is the session that we're going to host next month, where we're going to show movies related to the brain. And we're going to start with one of my personal favorites called My Love Affair with the Brain, the life and work of Miriam Diamond. And after the screening, we will have a discussion with the producer and director of the movie. The other format that we have are classical talks. So we still maintain the known format of having one speaker, one topic, and discussions afterwards. And then the most exciting new development is that we're going to have what we called the CNS comms session, where we team up with journals and their special issues and have a mini symposium dedicated to a special issue. So you will find something similar to like video abstracts for each paper of a special issue, and you can directly engage with the authors. So all of this is coming your way, one session a month. You can keep up to date by following us on the website, on Twitter, and on YouTube. And I'm going to share the links with you later on. So let me change to speak. Wonderful. Okay. So with that, I'm happy to welcome our speakers, and I'm going to give the floor to Olga to start us off.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I hope everybody has successfully submitted his or her abstract to the SNL conference. And of note, this year, somebody nominated Stephanie Forkel for the Early Career Award. So especially if you like our today's debate, please vote for her. If you don't, that's my and Leo's fault. Okay, I'll share my screen. Yeah. Okay. So I'm representing the Center for Language and Brain at the National Research University High School of Economics in Moscow, Russia. And yes, I was raised in Luria's tradition. I'm happy to talk about it today. But before going to my talk, I would like to raise 3 important points through which I would ask you to perceive my talk. First, despite the movement is titled that Luria contributed mostly to aphasiology, my suggestion for today would be that he largely contributed to aphasiology at his time. He didn't appear in the vacuum. A lot of other previous great researchers contributed to the knowledge, and he kind of reused a lot of concepts. Can you hear me well? Great. Yeah, and last year in Moscow, we had a great school on the history of aphasiology and its connection to modern research, with brilliant speakers like Rolin Bastianza, who is co-directing our Center for Language and Brain in Moscow, Rita Blazer, David Howard, and Carla Semenza. And of course, Luria largely used the heritage of the English and the German school at his times. The second point is that although I'm representing here this side, I'm definitely not the primary person in the world to present Luria's heritage. We're fortunate enough to have Luria students who are not only in good health, but very active professionally. And I hope at least some of them would join us today. Right, but today I'm focusing on Luria's contribution with not with the goal to claim that he's the only guy who contributed the most, but that he was one of people who did that. So actually last week he would have a birthday. So he would have 180 years old now, and he is deservedly considered, of course, the father of the Eastern neuropsychology, although he was originally a psychologist who got his second education as a medical doctor. And it's important to know, because we're going to compare his theory with the modern theories, that his clinical materials were brain damaged due to gunshot wounds, not strokes. This is very important. And based on this data, he produced a comprehensive theory on the mechanisms of impairment and localization of high cortical functions, including language. Again, he didn't appear from nowhere, and I would name, it's up to my knowledge, I would name 3 people who inspired his work mostly. First of all, this is Leo Vygotsky, which is greatly considered, at least in my country, and which you can conclude from graffiti on a wall in one of Moscow buildings. Leo Vygotsky is famous for his cultural historical psychology, and in particular for the his work on the development of language and other cognitive functions. And we will mention this notion a bit later. He's famous for the concept of inner speech, which Luria extensively used in his aphasia theory. The second person whom I would name is John Hewlings Jackson, who was, at least up to my knowledge and probably Luria's knowledge, one of the first guys who contrasted localization of a symptom with a localization of a function, saying that these are definitely not the same things. And the third person who affected Luria's work was Ivan Pavlov, a great Russian neurophysiologist, who, of course, all of you know his work very well, his work with dogs. But he introduced at this time a very progressive concept that about a function as a complex of dynamic temporal links, which is very familiar to us now when we consider a function as an interactive network of brain components. So getting back to the concept of central concepts of Luria's aphasia classification, we need to talk about what he considered a cognitive function. And there are 3 important aspects of it that I will go a little bit more in details in the next slides. But for now, it's important to point that he considered a cognitive function as a system, localizable only in its component parts, not as a whole, and as a dynamic system. So, sorry. Right. So talking about the system as a function, Luria suggested a very clear analogy that as any function of the organism, like digestion, respiration, etc., a cognitive function is not a function of a particular, very specific particular tissue. So it's the same for all functions of the organism, including mental functions, higher cortical functions. So he suggested that higher cortical functions are carried out by a functional system, a network of, that is a set of neural structures and their respective neurophysiological processes. And as a functional system, higher cortical function consists of many component parts like nodes, each based on work of specific brain areas and each playing a specific role in this system. Which is important for the injury story. He claimed that impairment of a single component part results in the disintegration of the entire functional system in the first trade, which can be reorganized afterwards. So talking about localization, so Luria pointed out that elementary functions can be localized, but complex functional systems like a cognitive function cannot. Cognitive functions may be grounded in many brain areas, each performing its role in this complex functional system. And only elementary functions can be directly related to specific brain areas. Those can be localized. These elementary functions is what he called factors, neuropsychological factors. This is one of the central concepts of his theory. So the identification of this same factor underlying the observed symptoms on the surface is the exact goal of the neuropsychological analysis. And this is what is done in the clinical settings in my country. As I said, a factor is an important concept in his theory. So this is exactly an elementary psychological component of a cognitive function, which has double nature. It's like light, right? On one hand, it relates to specific brain operations, to specific physiology and anatomy. On the one hand, it's a psychological unit, right? And it's important that aphasia, a language disorder, is not considered from this point of view as a separate impairment. It's just one of the way how a factor, a defective factor, can show up. Considering that we understand localization at this point from the perspective that it only refers to elementary functions. Talking about localization of a cognitive function, we need to attribute a dynamic nature to this kind of localization. So this set of zones of literally brain areas involved in performing a large cognitive function is never static. So we can approach a cup like this, or with the left hand, but we perform the function. The same is going on with any other cognitive function, including language. So due to damage or individual environment, there could be intra and intersystemic changes. And so the key feature of such functional system is mobility of their component parts. So again, as with a cup, there is an invariable task goal, which is related to variable execution mechanisms, and we end up with an invariable outcome. So localization, according to Luria, is dynamic. Factors, elementary components of the system can be localized, but neural basis of an entire function can change. So the goal of the neuropsychological analysis is to identify the basic underlying factor behind the superficial observed symptoms and localize these factors in the brain. at the morphological and physiological level. And to localize here means to reveal working zones involved in a complex functional system and to relate them to the structural elements of the psychological process. So let me exemplify that. So we've got a brain with a lesion, and we've got a number of symptoms of various kinds. And some symptoms can be primary, some could be derived from the primary, that is being secondary. And those symptoms cluster into syndromes. And the factor is the guy who underlies the syndrome, that is, gives rise to every symptom within this syndrome. So getting back to aphasia. So these are main aphasia types listed. And so for those who studied neuropsychology well at the university, all of these terms are very familiar. For those who didn't, I will comment a bit. Luria proposed to measure prefrontal or frontal syndromes, that is efferent mode aphasia, which is very close to what is known as Broca's aphasia, dynamic aphasia, which is often compared to transcortical mode aphasia, but thinking about the mechanisms of these two types of aphasia, I don't think that they have anything in common. He proposed afferent mode aphasia related to parietal lesions. Sensory aphasia is the classic Wernicke aphasia. Acoustic kinestic aphasia is a specific aphasia type proposed by Luria, but in its mechanisms, it's very similar to one type of conduction aphasia. And the semantic aphasia is the guy completely absent in the Western aphasia classification. I will talk about it a bit more. And these are lovely lesion overlays Luria produced himself. Let me stop a bit at the efferent mode, dynamic and semantic aphasia. I will talk about efferent mode aphasia to exemplify you how Luria treated the aphasia types, which is very familiar to all of us, Broca aphasia type. And I will talk a bit more about dynamic and semantic aphasia, which have no direct correspondence in the Western aphasia classification. So Luria proposed two prefrontal aphasia syndromes, one related to damage to inferior premotor areas, that is directly ventral premotor and pars apicularis, and the second one related to, I would say, more to pars triangularis and orbitalis and other prefrontal areas. So the first aphasia type, efferent mode aphasia, is very familiar to most of you, since here we have researchers dealing with aphasia or clinical specialists. So the symptoms are familiar. So these are difficulties with motor programming for articulation and all kinds of errors we observe in Broca aphasias, and but spared isolated sounds and verbal stereotypes. So there are positive and negative signs, as we know. Agrammatism is a typical feature of this aphasia type. Dysgraphia and dyslexia follow the pattern of the oral speech. So we observe element omission, no smooth transition from letter to letter transpositions and perseverations. We observe relatively spared comprehension, but, and this is an interesting point. It's for further discussion or thinking maybe. So Luria suggested that comprehension problems in efferent mode or Broca aphasia is a secondary symptom rising from difficulties due to co-articulation perseverations. I think this is an interesting idea. This was all about language, but these same patients have oral and manual praxis problems, lack of motor movements, motor stereotypes, but movement intention and the plan for the movement execution are intact. This is important to discuss the next aphasia type. So, for example, in this classic probe fist edge palm task, patients cannot move smoothly in between movements. So Lurie suggested that there is one single factor behind all those observed language and motor symptoms, which is disintegrated kinetic melody of movements understood broadly, language or motor movement. And the primary defect here, he called, is kinetic apraxia, that is impaired temporal organization for movements, again, not only in the speech domain. So this is, I think, a very good example how Lurie conceptualized symptom in much broader way than aphasia syndrome. Then the second syndrome, prefrontal syndrome, is dynamic aphasia. So speech symptoms in this aphasia type are difficulties in speech initiation and planning. So we observe echolalias, which results in defective dialogue. We observe stereotypic speech, no narratives, so just very short, simple sentences. And but speech, automated speech, repetition, naming, not propositional speech, I would say, all that is sped because Lurie suggested all of that does not require speech act planning. We observe no grammatism in this aphasia type, but simplifications again, because patients tend to produce short sentences with simple syntax. No dyslexia or dysgraphia to dictation, but no spontaneous writing, again, because of this initiation problems, and relatively sped comprehension. At the same time, all these patients have reduced intentional and emotional behavior. So Lurie suggested that these symptoms, behavioral and linguistic, root from the same problem, initiation impairment. So the factor he called important for the syndrome is impaired inner programming. And the primary defect was adynamia, impaired initiative. Again, not only in the speech domain. The third syndrome I would like to talk about is the semantic aphasia, which has no correspondence in the Western aphasia classification. Lurie related it to the damage of the TPO region, temporal parietal occipital junction, and linguistic symptoms observed in this aphasia type are very peculiar. Patients, so this is not a very severe aphasia, so it never gets very bad. And it's often not easy to diagnose it unless you probe with specific linguistic constructions where those patients are very bad. Lurie called these constructions logical grammatical sentences. And these are prepositional constructions, instrumental constructions, comparative, temporal, because time is the metaphor of the space, and attributive. So patients just don't, with semantic aphasia, don't understand who is sister's brother. But at the same time, again, those who are familiar with classic neuropsychology know all these signs of the Gestmann syndrome. So these patients have spatial apraxia, nausea, spatial dysgraphia and dyslexia, calculation problems. And for example, the head probe is very clearly shows that all these domains and directly spatial domain is problematic. So Lurie suggested that the central factor, like the elementary problem here, is impaired simultaneous spatial synthesis, or if we talk about language, quasi spatial syntaxes. So inability to process spatial relations between objects in the concrete space, but also in the symbolic quasi-spatial coordinates. That's about language. But the primary defect here called visual spatial processing disorder. Right. Yeah, I covered that. A clinical assessment with Lurie's approach is exactly probing different cognitive domains, not only language, doing qualitative analysis of errors, and concluding or identifying the underlying factor behind all these symptoms. And ideally, the treatment should focus on this underlying factor in the end, not superficial symptoms we observe. Talking about significance of Lurie's theory and its importance for modern science, I think there's 3 critical points. Lurie suggested a comprehensive, non-modular approach to language. And regarding anatomy, he definitely considered language anatomy as a network with critical nodes interacting with each other, but reorganizable, again, due to individual environment or brain damage. And which is very important is that already at his time, he focused on the underlying deficit. This is what we've relatively recently started to do in neurolinguistics. And let me point out that one of his first books, Traumatic Aphasia, was written in 1947. And all that I covered, all these points were very clearly introduced already at this time. Thank you very much. Steffi, we can't hear you.
Yes, here we go. Thank you very much, Olga. Leah, I'm going to hand it over straight to you. So take it away, and afterwards you two can discuss.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. So let me share my screen. And please let me know if this is working. Can I get a thumbs up if you guys can see my screen? Excellent. Thank you so much. So let me just put this in presenter mode here in just a second. All right. So once again, thank you very much for inviting me, Olga, Etta, Stephanie. For the audience information, we've had a few sessions leading up to the debate today, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time and the discussions we've had to make this debate informative, constructive, fun for everybody. I learned a lot already, so thank you again for inviting me. It's truly a pleasure. I have a few disclosures to begin with. So the first one is that I'm not a historian of neuropsychology. I do very much appreciate and like Lurie's theories. I learned that when I was in medical school. I still do the fist edge palming clinic till this day, and I really like that, and also his theories. But more importantly, who am I to say that somebody did or did not contribute to aphasia, right? I think we all did. And spoiler alert, in these 15 minutes in which I'll speak, I'm not going to pit this group versus that group, this person versus that person. That is obviously not constructive, right? The idea here is that there is a disease, there is a symptom from a sequela of a disease that doesn't have cure at the moment, and it's a common problem that we all have to work together towards solving. So you will see that a lot of my 15 minutes here are going to be about framing the question about contributing to aphasia and how we can use the information that we all have and shared, and how can we share this more to make it so that we can work a little bit better together and work more together, I guess, with regards to attaining a common goal. So again, you will see that the common theme here is how can we integrate more of these theories that are probably not as well known as we would want all across researchers, so as to maybe think about ways to achieve a common goal. And then obviously debates are important because that's how we learn, right? We learn by listening to somebody else, their ideas, their perspectives. But divisiveness is counterproductive. So that's not the idea. So here, even though I am quote unquote against the motion, I think my theme here is really more to discuss the motion, right? What is to contribute to aphasia? How can we continue to contribute to aphasia in a way that is clinically meaningful, etc. And particularly in times like these ones where there are all the coronavirus struggles, etc. What the world doesn't need is divisiveness. We need people to kind of work together, right? So I think that goes without saying. So here the theme is, how should we frame contributions to aphasia? So I'll start. So I have 15 minutes, and I'll be brief. The first 5 minutes, I'll talk a little bit about the research that we do. Stephanie and Ed asked us to give a little bit of an overview of the things that we do. The remaining 5 minutes, or the middle 5 minutes, will be to talk a little bit about a clinical context in which aphasia is encountered. And then the remaining 5, 10, or maybe the last 2, 3 minutes, I'll talk a little bit about what are potential solutions or alternatives or paths that we can go through in terms of integrating this information that we all have, to make more contributions to aphasia. So I have no conflicts of interest. I receive research support from the NIDCD and the NINDS. These are branches of the NIH. I'm very thankful for their research support. And if it weren't for their support, none of this that I'll be talking about here would have been possible. So starting a little bit with regards to discoveries in the field of aphasia, we all know that we can learn a lot about aphasia through neuroimaging and relating specific lesions and specific components about brain health with regards to the generation or the origin of symptoms and the resilience towards injury, and also the mechanisms of recovery. So here is an example of T1 weighted image and somebody who's a chronic stroke survivor. You can see the location of gliosis and necrosis from the stroke, and we can then relate those from with the clinical symptoms. But more importantly, we can do this in a quantitative way. As you all know, you can use neuroimaging processing methods to place lesions in the same space. And then we can statistically evaluate the relationship between lesion location and symptoms. As you all know, this was proposed by individuals before it was available to be done with imaging, but really was pioneered by Elizabeth Bate and Nina Dronkers in this paper from many years ago, which I'm showing on the right-hand side. So this is a very powerful tool for us to understand functional neuroanatomy. Now, there are other modalities with imaging, and we can combine those to better understand not only lesion location, but also the networks associated with syndromes, very much in line with what Olga mentioned regarding Luria's theories about functional systems. To give an example, this is data from diffusion tensor imaging, where it's possible to trace the locations of axonal projections within white matter. And what you see here in orange are the locations where there are reduced connections as a result of a stroke. So the stroke is shown in black. These are representative images from 2 individuals. And these locations in orange are areas that have been disconnected. So the magnitude of network lesion is beyond what we would have originally thought as being the boundaries of the lesion. And we can study this. We can study the presence of or absence of networks with regards to specific symptoms, therefore directly testing the theories about systems or networks. And this is done briefly by combining modalities. So here you see T1 weighted scans that are combined with functional scans or an atlas, for example, and those things are placed in the same space as the fusion tensor imaging. So there's a lot of image processing that goes into this to enable things to be compared with each other. But once that's done, you can then assess the locations of specific connections between regions. Just to give an example here, this is an image from an atlas. These are the locations of the ROIs in an atlas. You can see what fibers are connecting what, and then you can come up with specific networks and test the presence or absence of these networks in relationship to symptoms. I want to give a shout here to Chris Word and software, Surfice, that you're seeing here in the background. Many of you probably have used it, and I strongly recommend it. It's fantastic, and it's a great way to visualize data. There's also a version called MRI CroAS for MATLAB. So this is just a quick, selfless, shameless pitch to his software. So if you use that data, you can make maps of networks, commonly referred to as connectomes, and then you can do lesion symptom mapping like you would with Voxel lesions, but instead with connection lesions. So there's this idea you can use connectome lesion symptom mapping to do that. And this is a paper that describes a little bit how this is done. And in brief, what we can start to observe by using this method is that you can elucidate the relationship between damaged networks and their symptoms. So here on the left-hand side, you see the results from Voxel lesion symptom mapping, here exemplified as ROIs, a multivariate Voxel lesion symptom mapping analysis related to fluency, so the areas that are lesion and associated with fluency deficits. And on the right-hand side here, you see the same results, but with networks. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between the two of them, but I want to highlight that some of the areas that are not commonly lesion but are disconnected, for example, the angular gyres, seem to have a significant degree of involvement. And again, in line with the theory of systems and potentially even somatosensory transformation for speech, which is also in line with this idea that Olga mentioned about just overall somatosensory transformations, whether it's language or outside of language. And then using the same methods, you can then reevaluate the common symptoms associated with aphasia in the context of the network. So this nice study, Julius being the first author, provides an overview of how networks can be applied to the common syndromes. And it can also help you elucidate some specific things that could be helpful for treatment. So for example, these are the networks associated with the ability to entrain speech or have unison speech during a entrainment session with a speech therapy. So if you have those areas in blue, you're more likely to be able to do it. And if you have those areas lesion in orange or yellow, you're less likely to be able to produce spontaneous speech and therefore benefit from speech entrainment. Likewise, it can provide some reconciliation or further understanding of well-known symptoms. So for example, the inability to understand or comprehend words that is observed in primary progressive aphasia and has been ascribed to the temporal pole. It probably relates to a network that the temporal pole belongs to, as you can see here in this figure on the right-hand side, assessing the same deficit in individuals, not with PPA, but individuals with who are stroke survivors. So all this is interesting, of course, you know, again, shameless plug to the stuff that we do, but I think it's important to be humble and think about, is this contributing to getting people with aphasia better? So let me put this question in this context, right? What is it to contribute to aphasia? So I have prepared a fictional case report. Mr. ABC doesn't exist, right? He's just a representation of tens or hundreds of patients with similar histories that we've seen here, and I'm sure many other patients elsewhere with a similar history. So he's 56 years old. He presented to his primary care doctor, his primary physician, or general practitioner, as how it's commonly denominated in different countries. And his chief complaint is that he remains with trouble communicating. The relevant past medical history here is that his problems with communication started abruptly 2 years prior when he suffered a stroke while he was at work. Ever since then, he remains with problems communicating. In the beginning, he was weak on the right-hand side, mostly, predominantly in his face and arm, and he was mute. He couldn't produce speech, he couldn't comprehend, etc. But with time, he did get better, particularly in the first 6 months after the stroke. He regained the ability of understanding speech, but he remained with significant problems producing speech. If you look at his current Western aphasia battery assessment, again, this is made up, right? His spontaneous speech is 12 out of 20. His auditory verbal comprehension is pretty good. His repetition is not very good, from 4 out of 10, and his name is also not very good, 6.8 out of 10. His aphasia quotient is 65.6, and I remind you that that means aphasia. Less than 93 is compatible with aphasia. And on the Western aphasia battery revised classification criteria, he falls under conduction aphasia. That is the category that he belongs to. So you can see that he's got significant deficits with communication, and what can we do to make him better? So the question is, how can we as a group make contributions that will eventually lead to new treatments for which there is evidence that we could provide to Mr. ABC or the many Mr. ABCs or Mrs. ABCs that suffer from this problem? How can we combine the information or the knowledge that we know to make this better? And I would argue, and these are the 5 minutes of my presentation here, that Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, this is Mr. ABC's lesion. This is his, fake lesion, but this is where his lesion is. This is the necrotic and gliotic tissue from his stroke. So I would argue that what we need are large-scale studies to define evidence-based approaches with regards to treatment for aphasia. I would say or propose that what we should strive for is to combine the information that we have with regards to aphasia assessments and potentially new treatments to generate evidence-based approaches that can help treat Mr. ABC. That are innovative, that are different. We're still doing the same thing that we did 20, 30, even longer years, even more years ago, right? And for this, I want to highlight 3 studies briefly. One is this very good landmark clinical trial that was published in Lancet 3 years ago, which was one of the largest scales randomized controlled trials on aphasia treatment. And it concluded 3 weeks of intensive therapy or improve verbal communication in individuals who are 70 years of age or younger. I also want to highlight a recent study from the group in Columbia that we were lucky to participate. So it's the University of South Carolina. Julius Friedrichsen was the main person behind it. And this is a phase 2 study looking at transcranial direct current stimulation as an adjuvant therapy for aphasia. And if you're familiar with clinical trials, this is a phase 2, and the idea here was to define if studying in a definitive study TDCS was something futile or not, and it concluded that it's not. So obviously the burning question here is, can we define if it's definitive, and if it is, can we apply this, can we offer this as a new form of treatment? As I said, we haven't come up with anything new as a society, as a group for a long time, so it will be important to have new avenues. And then finally, again, it's a shameless plug to our group here. We have a clinical trial of early phase clinical trial on speech entrainment that is just about to start. And that is related to this theoretical idea that you can entrain speech in individuals who have the ability for somatosensory transformation of speech, a little bit based on the imaging findings that I've shown before that I'm just highlighting here back again. So this is my conclusion. As I said in the beginning, I'm really not against the motion. I'm really trying to just set up the framework for our discussion with regards to contribution to aphasia, and how can we as a society, as a group, combine our efforts and make contributions that are meaningful for individuals who suffer from aphasia. And then this is a little bit staged, I have to confess. We plan a few questions for the subsequent debate, and this is a question that I will pose to Olga and for everybody to debate, which is, Luria created a great theory, and can we talk a little bit how it's been tested experimentally, and how can we use it to inform treatments and assess outcomes in individuals with aphasia? So this is my presentation. Thank you very much again for having me. It's truly a pleasure, and I want to just highlight that a lot of the stuff that I showed here was really made by the folks in the lab, and really, it's really their work. And also, take a shout out to my colleagues at C-STAR at University of South Carolina who have done a lot of this work as well, particularly Julius Friedrichsen. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I love that you guys come with your own questions. I will give you up to 5 minutes now to respond to each other's questions or post new ones on your talk. And then I will hand over to Henrietta Howells to ask the questions from the audience to both of you. So the floor is yours. Olga and Leonardo.
Yeah. I'm sharing my screen.
Okay.
Right. Because I expected that question.
Oh, what is the promise?
I obviously wouldn't have time to talk about my own work during this presentation of Luria's work. So I've got a couple of slides exemplifying how we are trying to test his concepts experimentally. So can you see my slides now well?
Yes.
Okay. Because I have, right. And now? Right. So as I mentioned, we've done some work on semantic aphasia in particular. So we started with very simple behavioral experiments trying to test Lurie's predictions. As I mentioned, that those reversible logical grammatical constructions are problematic according to Lurie's predictions and are specific to semantic aphasia. So the first study we published, I think, in 2015 in Aphasiology, in this study, we tested propositional and instrumental constructions in a very simple paradigm. So we presented, that was a sentence picture matching paradigm. So we presented a sentence in one of the two conditions, for example, for prepositional ones, that was the grandpa is putting the barrel on the box or on the box barrel. Many of you might know that Russian has a very flexible, quite flexible word order with the two reversible pictures. And patients had just to point to the right picture. Same with instrumental constructions. The boy touches the pencil with the pen, or with the pen the pencil. And the hypothesis behind this conditions was that here for propositional constructions, the direct word order corresponds to the direct motor stereotype. So you first take the barrel and then you interact with the box, right? And in the sentences with indirect or reversed word order, the order of the mentioned objects does not correspond to the order of how you interact with objects in this world. But in the instrumental constructions, it's the other way around. You first take the pen and then interact with the pencil. So the direct word order does not correspond with this motor stereotype, and the indirect word order does. And this is what we've got. We tested a group of people with semantic aphasia, motor aphasia, sensory. This was efferent motor primarily, sensory and healthy controls, and there was no significant difference here in between. These are two positional constructions, two instrumental constructions in different conditions. Same here, but we've got a significant difference in the semantic aphasia. So for the propositional constructions where direct word order corresponded to the real world interaction with objects, we've got more correct responses, and in the instrumental constructions, that was the other way around. So basically, these predictions were driven directly from Lurie's theory, and we simply tested them, and they confirmed. The second time we approached Lurie's theory, not experimentally, but using modern neuroimaging, was in this work published in Cortex a couple of years later. So we, so patients with semantic aphasia are very rare. So we found 10 of them, scanned them, and first did, so these were patients with robustly clinically diagnosed semantic aphasia. And all those neuropsychological profiles are in the paper. So this is their lesion overlay with the focus on the TPO region as Lurie predicted, but that was not the main thing. So we, in this cohort, we had patients with TPO region spared. And then we did white matter mapping with an atlas and found that, yes, cortex, TPO cortex might be spared. But if the underlying white matter, all those associative white matter drugs with which we are very familiar, if at least one of them is impaired, is damaged, we've got semantic aphasia. So in this work, I think we've made a step forward from Lurie's theory, but were very strongly motivated by his concepts. Another example is dynamic aphasia, and let me advertise our recent work that was done in another clinical group with in neurosurgery patients. So we did language mapping intraoperatively, and the story goes as that was an accidental finding in one of the patients. So we actually tested different linguistic tasks, which is more sensitive in the frontal lobe to map language during operation. And we found that this particular patient was not responsive to a naming task, but couldn't complete a sentence. Then we went back to his tractography and identified that we stimulated exactly the terminal of the frontal ascending tract. So from that point, we started collecting such cases, and now we've published 12 of them. So we presented 2 tasks intraoperatively, a naming task, action naming task, and the sentence completion with the 2 words presented. This is the pig is chewing, and a patient has to read the 2 words and to complete with the 3rd one. Here, the green balls are the dissociative sites. That is where a patient could name a picture, an action, but couldn't complete a sentence. And without Lurie's theory, I don't think we would be able to understand why is that. And this is because of his concept of dynamic aphasia. And so we added the white matter link between the, which is fat, frontal ascending tract, between the posterior inferior frontal cortex and the SMA area. But Lurie would predict that by stimulating either the terminations of the frontal ascending tract or the frontal ascending tract itself, that would result in spontaneous speech problems, not naming problems. And this is exactly what we've got in this study. Right. That was the answer to one of your questions. And I would like to agree with you, Leo, that our final goal is to help an individual. And you've got a great example, although a fake one, of this patient with conduction aphasia. And if I were Lurie, I would ask you, what type of conduction aphasia is it? Because for repetition and reproductive conduction aphasia, Lurie had different theories, and treatment should be different.
Thank you, Olga. That's a great question. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, so we fit a constellation of symptoms into one name, right? Which is kind of like a one size fits all. So I don't know Rui's classification to a T, so I would defer to you if you to teach me, how he would have devised that. What I would pose as a question back, if I may, is could we use that information in any way to treat or to tailor treatment, or at least to test a tailored treatment? And I think we can think about it in 2 ways. One is, could we define whether if we tailor treatments to individuals, maybe overall people get better, right? So if you have 100 people, maybe everybody got better by a little bit in comparison with the control, of course, right? In comparison with a one size fits all that is not tailored to therapy. Or at least we could look into whether a tailored treatment would increase the probability that some individuals in that sample would have an improvement. Maybe out of 100 people, 70 won't improve that much, but there's 30 individuals that will. So maybe this is a way that we can devise a little bit how we can tailor treatments that could either help overall the population of individuals with aphasia, or at least some individuals a lot more, right? So these are just thoughts, of course.
Mm-hmm. I think that, of course, this is clinical reality, right? We're searching for the best tailored treatment, but we're not very successful in many cases so far. But in this particular case, why I'm asking, right, what kind of conduction aphasia it was? Because if this is the repetition conduction aphasia, then the problem is the verbal working memory, and we should train that. For the reproduction aphasia type, these are different brain areas, there's a different mechanism. This is like the most prominent symptom, as you of course know, is the conduit de proche. And so there's a completely different thing that we should treat. So this is a great example of how great thoughts from the past could greatly and very easily contribute to our clinical work.
I would not disagree with that at all, Olga. I think that's very smart and it's very insightful. And I think we need clinical trials to test those, right? I
Exactly,
think, you know,
right.
if before we offer this to somebody or charge somebody for a treatment, I think we need a clinical trial to define if it's you know, if there's evidence behind it. But I think that's a wonderful idea.
Right, and I agree that yes, from theoretical point of view, Luria suggested great things which can be maybe redigested now and reused for our own purposes and in light of all other evidence we have. But I, of course, admit, and I can do that because I'm a linguist and a researcher, not a clinical specialist. So you would get a real fight if I were a clinical psychologist, which I'm not. That from a clinical trial point of view, from experimental testing point of view, Lurie's theory is still waiting its time. I agree with that.
Yeah, I don't know if we have any more time to discuss this further, but you know, for the audience, one of the obvious things that came up in our pre-debate discussions was the fact that we needed to highlight and share more of that information for a broader audience, right? I think that's great.
I've got a quick question for you, for the both of you. One of the, in Olga, in your talk, you mentioned the importance of, that Luria raised the point that there are specialized networks and raised this point very early on. And Leo, in your talk, you showed that neuroimaging now validates that idea. But what I was interested in was the first point that you made, Olga, about the overlap between domains. So he highlighted that there was an overlap between different functions. And I was wondering whether both of you could comment on whether that might be a way of approaching treatment, perhaps. Olga,
Leo,
maybe?
would you like to
Or
start? I can start.
Either way, yeah.
Yeah, I can actually comment on from theoretical point of view, and Leo could add from neuroimaging point of view. And so this is exactly what Luria proposed, that there are overlapping nodes for different cognitive functions. And this is the rising point for reorganization. We'll know that some aphasia symptoms can be at least partly overcome with like turning on executive functions, right? So with the with more control, patients can do better in language. And I think this is all about that. This is about common nodes which are becoming more active, or maybe subordinary nodes more involved in a different function used to compensate. That was the theory.
Yeah, so my 2 cents here, I agree with you guys. And Anna, that's a great question. I think we could think about imaging or any biological probe as another way to phenotyping the individual, right? So I showed before a Western aphasia battery subscale. You can get individual, that was ABC, you can get individual GEF, right? It may have exactly the same or very similar scores, and yet the lesion is very different. The network that is damaged is somewhat different. The question, I think, is whether if we were to use that information to define treatment, right? So this person has, I'm just going to make stuff up here, but let's say that person has less disconnections in the medial temporal region. Should we then therefore try to recruit more memory or verbal memory based approaches? Is that going to make a difference, right? So I think there are a few ways that this could be approached. One is, could we use that phenotyping evidence that comes from clinical and neuroimaging data so as to tailor treatment? And does that really matter, right? And there's a possibility that it doesn't. There's a possibility that what matters is the proof is in the pudding, is whatever the clinical symptoms the individual has. But there may be a possibility that it does. And I think, my guess, and this is obviously just a guess, is that the degree of compromise of networks that comes from the burden of cerebrovascular disease, right? So how much white matter disease somebody has, how much white matter they have here or there and anywhere, beyond the stroke is probably something that has a lot to do with resilience to injury and plasticity for recovery. That's a testable hypothesis. And that might be, very much what Olga mentioned with regards to distributed idea. So particularly as you think about these tertiary functions, maybe somewhat plastic in terms of being able to be placed in different places, right? We could very straightforwardly test this hypothesis. But again, just to belabor the point a bit, I think these are hypotheses that need to be tested. If we want to provide this as a treatment, if we want to offer this as a treatment, and somebody's going to pay for it, is going to spend time doing it, etc., I think it's good to have, obviously, the more evidence that we can get behind it. But it's a great idea, and I think I think this is where we collectively need to go.
Okay, I have both of you, and that is, do you have any literature that would be good reading for early students of aphasia? And yeah, so if you have any, that would be great, apart from Luria, of course.
Olga, I'll start with this one. Yeah, there's a plethora, right? There's a large number of studies from many different sites, and I think the nice thing is that there's a lot of convergence between theories, right? This whole idea of networks haven't been proposed by Luria. They were proposed by people before, and then we are bound to repeat history, and then we see a lot of these networks nowadays, etc. To make a summary here, we had discussed making an article out of this debate. Excuse me. So I think this would be a good way for us to think as we consider putting a lot of references to this. Obviously, I won't make a list of everything here, and I probably won't remember everything, but nowhere near. But I think that's a good point, and I think as we think about making an article out of this, we can certainly share some of the important references.
Right. May I ask who asked that question?
I don't know whether I'm allowed to give that away, that information away. Right,
because I was about to catch the most interesting question and to send Luria's book to this person. And I think this is the one which deserves it. So please contact me and give me your address.
That's awesome. That's really cool.
Okay, great. Well, I think we have overrun a little bit, so probably we should wrap up. But I'd like to thank both of you, Leo and Olga, for giving such interesting talks and stimulating such interesting debate. The point you make, Leo, about how debates are a constructive, very constructive thing, but how divisiveness is the problem and it's counterproductive is very important. So I'd like to thank you all for listening. And I'd like to invite you on the 27th of August to come and see the talk that we're going to be having on Marianne Diamond. And we hope you can all join us. We'll be putting it out on Twitter and Facebook and everywhere else. And yeah, so see you next month. And thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you.